afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us for our webinar on the new COVID customer in Latin America. My name is David Delgado. I am the Digital Marketing Director for America's Market Intelligence, and I'm going to be serving as the moderator for today's webinar. So before we get started, I just want to give you a quick overview of what to expect today. Essentially, we're going to have about 45 to 50 minutes of presentation in which we share the results from the study that we did. And then at that point, we're going to take questions from you, the audience. You can ask questions at any point in time. You don't have to wait until the end of the webinar. You can do it whenever you like. The way that you do it is if you look at the ribbon on your screen, you should see a series of icons, and one of them is going to say Q&A. So you would click on the Q&A icon. It brings up a window. You type in your question, hit enter, and we receive it. So as I said, feel free to ask away at any point in time. Now, one of the big questions we always get here is the video going to be available after the webinar, or the presentation slides going to be available after the webinar? And the answer to that is yes and yes. What we typically do is about 24 hours or so after the webinar ends, we send out the materials to everyone who is registered. So those materials definitely will be available. So that's one of the big questions we get. You don't have to ask it because I just answered it. All right. So if you have any other questions, as I said, you will be able to do that through that particular Q&A function that's going to be on your screen. So let's move on a little bit. And this brings us to our legal notice, I believe. And in the legal notice, I'm not going to read it because it's going to take too long basically to go through, but essentially I encourage you to read it at your leisure. Essentially, it covers a lot of the information that we're going to be discussing today. And one of the big takeaways here is that the opinions that are expressed here today by our panelists are their own personal views and not the views of the organizations that they represent. But please read that legal notice at your leisure to fully understand everything that's being discussed today and the ramifications of that. All right, this brings us now to our introduction. So I'm going to be introducing the speakers for today. So let's take a look at those. I'm over there on the left. Of course, leading us off is going to be John Price, the Managing Director of AMI, followed by John Holcomb, the Senior Vice President for Latin American Research for ECHO-MR. And then, of course, Ricardo Alvarez, who is the Director of our Consumer Services Practice here at AMI. So these are going to be the three speakers today, sharing the results of a really fascinating study. So let's move on a little bit further now to AMI itself and our background. And to continue with that portion of the presentation, I'm going to turn the floor over to John Price so he can talk to you a little bit more about our company and how long we've been around and our trajectory. John.
Thanks so much, Abel, and welcome everyone. We're very pleased once again to attract you as an audience to our webinars. We've been conducting webinars for 2.5 years, but we've done more of them in the last 3 months than we had in the previous 2 years. And that only happens really with a number of things that we're very fortunate to have. One is an amazing team, and full credit goes to Abel, who not only starts off our webinars and directs you guys, the audience, but also does all the work in terms of the outreach to attract you to our webinars and then delivering the content afterwards. We also are very fortunate to have attracted anywhere from 500 to 1,500 people registering for each of our webinars. And so kudos to all of you who've taken the time to listen to what we have to say and to absorb our materials. And last but not least, I want to point out that you cannot put on this many webinars of this quality without great partners. And this week, we're really happy and pleased to have with us John Holcomb of ECHO Market Research. ECHO, and John will explain in further detail, but they were instrumental in bringing very innovative methods to recruiting people across these key markets to take an online survey in rapid fashion. And it is speed that is essential right now in capturing the pulse of people while they're in quarantine. On a more personal note, I've known John for over 20 years. We've worked together many times, and it's a real pleasure to have him with us. Now, we are very proud and fortunate to conduct as many webinars as we do, but that's not what pays the bills. We are a consulting firm who works to inform its clients and advise its clients on their business decisions in Latin America. We go to market and we serve our clients through key practices. Today, our practice being featured is consumer services, which is led by Ricardo Alvarez, a 30-year veteran of market research in Latin America, who led market research efforts at MasterCard, at Unilever, at Kodak, and elsewhere. We've also, you've probably heard webinars of ours in logistics, payments, natural resources, the industrial sector, and healthcare. Now, what do we do for our clients per se? Abel, if you could take us to the next slide. We help our clients make decisions. Do they enter a market? Do they divest from a market? Should they acquire a company? How should they launch their next product? Who should there be their target market? Where are their risks? Which competitors should they emulate? These are some of the questions that our customers come to us with. And we look through these problems or these challenges through three lenses. One is the customer, market research, and you're going to see an example of that today, but also the competition and how they might react, as well as the business context, which is a combination of the economic situation, the political situation, and the regulatory environment in which our clients operate. If you look at all three of those lenses, you will provide a more complete picture for customers to make smart business decisions. And with that, I'm going to pass the baton to Ricardo, who will tell you a little bit about what we're doing specifically around COVID.
Thank you, John. At the onset of the crisis, when we all went along party, we came up with a series of initiatives to keep people informed. For example, this webinar is part of this initiative. This is the 10th webinar series in 3 months, as just mentioned. We broadcast webinars on specific industries, highlighting specific issues. We also have weekly coffee chats to try to replicate the networking and information sharing that people are missing for being in isolation. This is bringing together peers in your industry. With our clients, we are heavily involved in 2 main areas. One is helping them to calibrate their plans for this year and next, based upon changed assumptions in their markets, their customers, price sensitivity, and demands, et cetera, et cetera. And also helping them monitor their industry, monitor what their clients are doing, what their competitors are doing, and what the regulators and policymakers are doing to impact their business. With that, I'm gonna pass back to our partner, John Holcomb.
Thank you so much, Ricardo and John and Abel, for having me here today. It's really a pleasure. John and I and AMI have worked together for a number of years, and it was a real treat to be able to do this particular study with them and have such a great sponsor behind it and such great analytical minds and knowledge of the Latin American region. Echo, at the outset of COVID, Echo Market Research sponsored a series of 10 essentially free surveys in the United States for our clients and their clients to help understand what was happening with their customers in the United States in the pandemic. And when we got the opportunity to do one for Latin America, we jumped on it. And so we're happy to be able to share that data with you today and the insights that come from the study. To put it shortly, Echo is an international full-service marketing research agency. We have offices in the UK, the US, Australia, and importantly, a team of 13 fantastic analysts in Latin America. Next slide, please, Abel. I think what we're best known for is our non-traditional approach to finding people, not professional survey takers. To participate in qualitative and quantitative marketing research studies, we employ a custom blend of online and social outreach for each and every study. And with that, I'd like to turn it back to Abel to take us through the next few slides.
All right, thank you so much, John. Okay, well, before we get started with the results of the study, the next portion of our presentation is going to focus on sort of the backdrop, so to speak, sort of the pandemic forecast in terms of Latin America, because that's obviously what's influencing consumer behavior. So we want to go over that. Now, before we get into that part of the presentation, however, we sort of want to take the temperature of the room with a poll of our own. We want to sort of get your perspective on an issue. So I'm going to launch this poll now momentarily. And basically, you're going to be able to see take up your screen, and you just pick on the response that you think is best, and we'll be able to calculate the results in real time and share them with you. So let's launch that there. This particular poll, yep, it is up and running. You should be able to see it. And it basically is asking you which country do you think will be in the best economic condition 1 year from today. So we have a number of different options here, obviously, with some of the major markets. So let's give that a little bit of time to be able to tabulate those results. All right. Well, from a prelim standpoint, it looks like Chile is ahead, but then now Colombia is pulling ahead. It's almost like a horse race in that sense, seeing the results tabulate there in real time. All right, we are getting close to getting enough people voting so that we can give you a decent sample here. A few more seconds, and then we'll be able to share those results with you. Give me 1 second. Let's see here. All righty, excellent. So let's share those results here. So what we can basically see here is that, yeah, Colombia pulled out the victory. So Colombia is the country that you think is going to be in the best shape between a year from now at 34%, followed by Chile at 31%. And then the other countries have smaller percentages, of course. Brazil at 10%, Mexico at 14%, Argentina at 3%, not all too surprising there considering the circumstances. Peru at 7% and Ecuador at 0%. So those are the basic results now. By the way, before I turn the floor back over to John to start this other portion of our presentation, I want to remind you that obviously we just asked you a question. You can ask us questions whenever you like. If you've gotten here late, basically the way to do it is if you look at the screen, you should see on the ribbon of your screen, sort of a black rectangle, a ribbon of sorts, that's going to have a series of icons. One of them is Q&A. You click on that. It brings up a window. You type in your question, hit enter, and then you'll be able to send your question to us. And at the end of the webinar, after the initial presentation, we'll take as many questions as we possibly can and try to give you answers. All righty. Well, thank you so much. Let's stop the share results now, and I'm going to turn the floor over to John Price to talk a little bit about the backdrop in terms of COVID and what's going on in Latin America as we speak. John.
Great, thanks, Abel. So please keep in mind that our polls, there is a limit to how many responses we can have. One of the questions was, why wasn't Panama included? There are, of course, 21 countries in Latin America, up to 40 if you include Caribbean nations. So please bear in mind that. But right now, Latin America is to quote a few different major media outlets, is the center of the storm, of the COVID storm. Brazil is projected to it's already number 2 in terms of total deaths and may in fact eclipse the United States eventually. At this point in time, based upon data as of 24 hours ago, the death rate of COVID in Latin America is about 1/3 of the worst countries that were hit in Western Europe, Belgium being the worst, but Holland, Italy, Spain, the UK, etc. In Western Europe, COVID is by far the leading cause of death this year. In Latin America, that may not end up being the case. Heart disease is actually the #1 cause of death in Latin America. And in fact, even though things look really grim right now in Latin America, it is worth reminding ourselves that Latin America actually moved quite quickly to quarantine at very different levels of political support from country to country and different levels of effectiveness. As you can see in countries like Argentina and Colombia, they've been very effective at limiting the death toll of COVID. In fact, the death toll in both countries is less than the flu in 2017. However, and we'll get to this in a moment, there is a very different story to be told country to country in terms of the economic toll of quarantines. But in terms of death rates, it's worth reminding ourselves that for Latin America, as deadly as COVID is, it is still not as deadly as other risks to particularly elderly Latin Americans. Let's move to the next slide. Now, the famous bending of the curve, and as you can see on there, superimposed on the right is Germany. Germany has brought the daily death toll downwards. There's been sporadic surges here and there, but generally speaking, they've moved it down. And in countries in Europe, in most countries in Asia, particularly East Asia, they waited until that curve was bent downwards until death rates were dropping before opening up. That was less so the case in the United States and across Latin America. And on the left, you see a specific table of statistics that show how many days ago was the total deaths half of what it is today. So the lower that number, the faster the virus is growing at a deadly level. And the higher the number, the more it has slowed down, the more they have bent the curve. And so the question is Latin America, from a purely epidemiology point of view, coming out of lockdown too early? And the answer is almost certainly. But at the same time, the cost of lockdowns, particularly in countries that don't have fiscal resources, who can't print their own money without provoking inflation, who do not have testing facilities, who do not have well-equipped IC unit sufficient to handle all of the things that we know are necessary to handle this epidemic, they don't have. And so as a result, many of them are deciding to leave quarantine, probably ahead of the advice of some of their health officials. Let's move to the next. When we look at Latin America economically versus other regions of the world, Latin America is projected to be the most hard-hit economically region in the world because of COVID. And the negative 8.5% projected GDP drop this year is probably going to have to be reassessed at the end of the year, and we believe could go as low as negative 10%. Other parts of the world will probably have to reassess downwards their GDP numbers as well. If we look at a more country-to-country point of view on the next slide, we see that here one has to take with a grain of salt these numbers. Peru is the latest country to publish its numbers. Peru has, in our estimation, the most professional Ministry of Finance today in Latin America. And part of that is a very honest appraisal of their GDP forecast. Colombia, the official number right now standing is less than 6%, negative 6%. We don't think that's accurate. We think that, and based upon partly on our survey and seeing the pain being suffered across wide swaths of Colombian population, that the actual GDP forecast will be much lower and could easily reach negative 10. It's the smaller countries in Latin America who could more easily contain the virus as it came from people returning from holidays and studies in Europe, and to a lesser degree in the United States, that were able to contain the virus and were able to deploy national healthcare assets and resources more quickly. It's the larger countries that are having more challenges with this. And at that point, I think that's the end of my presentation at this point. I will hand it back or over to, I believe it's John Holcomb, who will introduce some of the survey results that we analyzed.
Thank you, John. So Abel, let's take a look at some of the results on the next slide, please. Just quickly on the survey methodology, we really designed this survey to be a number of things. Respondent friendly, it was mobile first, it was agile, we did it quickly, and it was economical. And in less than 10 days, we received over 2,000 completed surveys across the 3 countries utilizing active recruiting. The survey is of online adults. The survey was, of course, online, and the majority of people took it on their smartphones, as you would imagine. What we've done here, combining Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, is to balance the data to reflect the population distribution, age, and gender of internet users across those 3 countries. And as I mentioned, we did it all between May 28th and June 6th. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at some of the interesting results of this study. In many ways, COVID-19 has forced people around the world to purchase more online. And it's very apparent that that's happening as well in Latin America. Our study revealed 5 segments of online consumers in Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia. Retreaters, those that are buying less. Maintainers, those that are buying the same online that they were before the pandemic. adapters, people who are purchasing slightly more online because of the pandemic, disruptors, those that are purchasing a lot more online because of the pandemic, and a new segment, which we of course called newbies, who made a new online purchase for the first time as a result of the pandemic. And you can see that overall, retreaters and maintainers account for about 4 out of 5 of every 10 online consumers in the 3 countries. And as we'll see, it's really the adapters, the newbies, and especially the disruptors who have the potential to radically change e-commerce in Latin America. Owing to their relative levels of e-commerce maturity, Colombia has the largest percent of newbies, and Brazil, the most mature e-commerce market, has the largest percentage of disruptors. Also, you can see here that Colombia, with the strictest quarantine in the region, has the largest percentage of retreaters, that 21% of people who are reducing their online purchases. And you'll see that that's very much correlated with the economic impact on jobs and employment in the region. On the next slide, please, Abel. So who are the people that make up these segments? Let's look at some of the highlights here. There's a lot of data on this chart, so I'll just go take you through some of the highlights. Looking at retreaters, they're more likely to be over the age of 45, and more than half have children at home. So there's a lot more mouths to feed in that segment. Maintainers are the youngest segment, likely just starting out and trying to keep their heads above water during the quarantine. They haven't really changed their behavior. They're treading water there. Disruptors are the most educated. 60% have a master's or PhD, and that number rises up to 90% in Brazil. Disruptors are between the ages of 35 and 44. They're the most likely to be married and the least likely to have children in their homes. On the right-hand side, the newbies, an astonishing 6 out of 10 are females, 62%. Mostly between the ages of 35 and 54 years old. Newbies have a lower level of educational attainment than any other segment. They're the least likely to be married formally, but about half have children in the home. And that percentage rises to 77% in Colombia, where people have children under the age of 18 in their home. So now I'll turn it over to Ricardo to look at the economic impact on each one of these segments.
Thank you, John. Abel, if we kindly pass to the next, thank you. What we have learned in this survey is that Latin Americans are suffering a heavy toll from these quarantines, both economically as well as to their physical well-being. And this impact really stems from the differences being felt economically. Newbies are typically women, 62%, as John Holcomb pointed out. They work in the informal sector. They also consume in the informal sector. Many of them lost their jobs because they work outdoors. They cannot replicate their work online, as you can see. Their incomes have dropped dramatically. The same for retreaters. Retreaters, in fact, from the e-commerce standpoint, are spending less because overall they are spending much less. Newbies, they are probably spending less as well, but they are being forced online, obligated to go online by COVID, and therefore they are spending more. Disruptors and adapters, but especially disruptors, are the most affluent of this group. They are the most educated, and as you can see, their incomes have dropped the least, and they treat to their jobs either temporarily or permanently, although there is a certainty less dramatic than in other places. Disruptors especially are working longer hours because they are white-collar workers working from home. Most of them are business owners working from home as well. They are sleeping much less, and they are eating worse as well. So these are important points of anxiety and stress that you as a marketeers need to keep in mind when you are reaching out very different sources of anxiety for each group. If we go to the next slide. Thanks. What we have learned in these surveys is perhaps one of the most important messages we have learned. And this is a pivotal moment in the lives of Latin Americans, stuck in their homes, out of work, or more idle because of less work, living either alone or living in close quarters with extended families. All brings this different level of stress and anxiety. And the way that they are reacting to that anxiety and stress in this moment, or this pause in their life, varies tremendously, from very positive sensations to a very negative ones. What we have seen is that 41% often because of job income or income loss, are now feel that they have to redefine who they are. They have to redefine what they are going to do with their career, what they are going to do with them. But they see some positive light, and this is an opportunity for many of them to start fresh. Others who have perhaps more free time on their hands and suddenly find themselves 24 hours a day with the people who are closest to in their lives, with the children, their partner, or even with parents in their household, see a silver lining. There is also a percentage of population that is just angry and scared. They are frustrated about their declining health risk to their health. They are frustrated about their declining income, and they are mad about the strict warranty policies that have robbed them of their livelihood. And then there are those who are more cool-headed about things more sanguine. These tend to be people who are more affluent, so they don't have as much as an economic concern, but they find themselves very stressed out, and so they are reassessing some of their priority. Now let's explore these emotions in each of our segments in the next page. The takeaway from this page we want to communicate is that as marketeers, it is not enough to come up with a message of empathy or a message of sympathy. You have to go more nuanced. You got to understand how COVID has impacted your target segment or your audience. If you are dealing with disruptors, which many of you are, that's often the most sought after consumer growth. These are professionals, they can maintain their incomes, etc. These people have both the economic and the education tools to make great decisions in their lives. They like to inform themselves, and they're generally not overly anxious at the moment, but they are very much, as they are a skeptical group of people. They've been through downturns before, they've survived downturns before, and they are not easy convinced with simplistic messages. And then we have the retreaters. These are people whose economic well-being has been the most negatively impacted. There are a wide range of education levels, but they are nonetheless more inclined to be angry, to be scared. They are not going to respond well to an upbeat message. They are particularly cynical in this moment of time, so we have to be very careful. The newbies are people who, again, they are predominantly women, 62% of them are women. Oftentimes they have children, but are unmarried, so they might be single moms. They are in many ways, before the COVID, they were the busiest people in society. Not only they were raising the kids at home, but they were also working outside the home. And oftentimes they were also looking for their parents. So what's interesting is, although they've been economically impacted, they have adopted quite well in terms of moving online to purchases for the first time. but also they have a little more free time on their hands compared to their very, very busy lives that they had pre-COVID. And that has given them the ability to really appreciate what the simple things in life have to offer. The silver lining is simple things, or the simple things with life, with their kids, with their health, valuing the health and the free time. This is the emotional mapping that we prepare for you as a framework. One thing that we want to encourage you to do is when you go out and research your customer base, is that you include these motive questions to better understand the state of mind of your consumer after this period of time. We go to the next slide. We just wanted to show some of the questions or the quotes, not the question, the quotes that we pulled out from the survey. So we did have a couple of open-ended questions, and this was an opportunity for people to write about their aspirations. What we saw was that part of this whole exercise of quarantine is grappling with this new digital life that people have adopted. And one of the biggest sources of frustration is that the lack of bandwidth of their internet connectivity. This is a problem around the world. And the whole connectivity of last mile connectivity is being put under strain by the increase of use, but people are also discovering search. They are discovering so much that the internet offers to them in terms of options. So they are educating themselves in terms of training themselves in entertaining and understanding messaging of discovery, and also based on their curiosity. So we want to have this information to analyze what they said in the open-ended questions, so we build that for that. With that, I'm going to pass back to John Holcomb, so we can go to see more analysis of the survey.
Thank you, Ricardo. When we look at the potential shift to e-commerce when the quarantines end, I think COVID looks to do for Latin American e-commerce perhaps what SARS did to the Chinese e-commerce landscape in 2003. It looks like there's a potential for a big shift to making regular purchases online, excluding Uber or Netflix. Before quarantine, about 40% of the total respondents across the 3 countries said they were making about 21 or more percent of their purchases, regular purchases, online. When we ask them the same question about what they think after quarantine, that number goes up to about 53%. And that's the orange down below after quarantine, the blue is before. On the horizontal axis, just to explain this chart a little bit, that is the percent of regular purchases that people were making before in blue or after in orange, and believe what they will be making after in orange. So you can see a fairly distinct shift to higher percentages of online buying. After quarantine, 53% might be purchasing over 21% of their regular purchases online, but who's going to be driving that shift? Well, as you can probably guess, it's not going to be the retreaters or the maintainers. Go to the next slide, please, Abel. It will be the adapters and the disruptors primarily pushing a very large wave of e-commerce. After quarantine, 62% of adapters and 80% of disruptors believe that they will be making more than 21% of their regular purchases online. Next slide, please. Let's take a closer look at the newbies. They look to get into the game as well, with almost 30% believing that they'll make 21% or more of their regular purchases online after quarantine ends. And remember, they were starting from 0 before quarantine. During the quarantine, what's happened is the newbies have made one or more new online purchases for themselves. About half used home delivery services and bought non-food products online for the first time. Just about a third bought food online, used online banking for the first time, used a credit or debit card for the first time. Just to talk a little bit about the mindset here. It's interesting to think about the new normal. I have a great question here that I have to answer from this explainer about market research. People, humans don't really want to adjust to a new normal. I think human beings want to go back to normal. But we don't know how that's going to pan out just yet. So nobody has a crystal ball. I think question mark marketers and market researchers who are watching their markets reshape real time, right in front of our eyes, watching everything reshape. Is new behaviors and attitudes are going to stay post-COVID? And that's the next question.
John, it's John Price here. Unfortunately, your connectivity is breaking up, and we're not able to hear you well. So if it's okay, I'll just conclude this slide.
Sorry about that.
No, it's often an issue in these webinars. So as John was saying, these newbies are interesting because, and as Ricardo pointed out, they're often informal workers who also consumed informally. And what is exciting to the payments industry, to the banking industry, to the e-commerce industry, is it's an entire generation of people who were not engaged digitally and now are suddenly engaged digitally, forced by COVID to do so. And even though their overall spending might be in retreat, by forcing themselves to shop online, they've gone from a very small presence online to a much bigger presence. And as you can see, their purchases have really been driven by necessity. Home delivery of food because they can't go out. Food products because they can't shop in a grocery or they feel afraid to do so. Online banking because, again, going to a bank in the crowded lines that often associate with banking in Latin America is perceived as risky. So these are very interesting shifts, and these are shifts that many in the e-commerce and payments space have been waiting to happen as a sign of a more mature e-commerce market. Abel, do you want to take us to the next one? Okay. One of the things that we wanted to point out when you do a survey like this, and you ask people about intentions, and you also ask them about their actions, you can get contradictory results. So when we ask people about exercise, and this is similar to results seen in other parts of the world, everybody feels conscientious that they need to exercise more. Almost, more people put on weight than lost weight during COVID. The same is true in Latin America. At least it's true amongst those who are connected online. And as you can see, people intend to exercise more in the gym, but they also intend to exercise more at home. At the same time, there's very true clarity that comes out of results as well. And travel and choice of travel method is one of those. Public transportation, which is absolutely essential in the large cities in Latin America and has been shunned by consumers during COVID, will struggle to attract ridership back. People are afraid to go into a subway, into a crowded bus, and many are saying that they're going to prefer to drive. So we can imagine that traffic, which has always been bad in Latin America, is only going to get worse in the short term. We also know that when comparing, you don't see it here, but when we asked about intentions to fly for travel, we also received a strong preference for making trips, holiday trips, business trips in a car versus flying. So definitely car travel will go up. And Abel, if you want to take us to the next slide. What you see here is the signs of a new normal coming online. One is that people, even retreaters, envision themselves shopping more online after COVID than before. Of course, that's assuming that they get their jobs back and that they have the means to spend. But there's no question that the movement online, although it may retreat in some categories, is definitely overall going to increase. But people are still going to go out and shop in certain retail environments. And the most popular of those are convenience stores. And certainly their penetration in Latin America has grown a lot over the last 20 years and become an important channel. In terms of how people will dine, people are reticent to dine in restaurants at this point in time. They don't envision themselves returning to restaurants at the same frequency they did before COVID. And they do envision spending more time eating at home using takeout food. So that will be a paradigm shift that, although it may retreat somewhat, will nonetheless be considerably more than it was pre-COVID. Let's go to the next slide and look at what are the priorities of product categories of consumers. And this is a very telling slide. You know, what we considered essential pre-COVID or high priority purchase items has shifted dramatically. And it's really shifted because of concern over connectivity, with, you know, on average, 35 to 40% of respondents saying putting a high priority and definitely planning to either expand their internet capacity with better programs, or many of them are connecting only by phone, will ramp up to something more fixed line in their homes. Sneakers for sports. So again, this aspiration to get in shape. Latin America is the second most obese region in the world after North America. And as a result, there's a common sense that people need to get back in shape. And most of us have put on weight during lockdowns. And so the impetus to get in shape is strong. But also people are concerned about in health insurance and life insurance have, and I mean by that, I mean private health insurance and life insurance, have not traditionally received very high penetrations of society in Latin America. But what we see is a very strong indication that they want to go out and purchase these products. And these intention levels are well above the present penetration levels of these products in Latin America. So that is a singular opportunity for people in those industries. Okay, next I'd like to just summarize a little bit before we get into Q&A, the conclusions that we learned in the research and the implications that our team, together with John, have come up with as to what we think it means for you as marketers. So, number one, this is a health crisis, but it's a health crisis felt by some. It's an economic crisis felt by many. Another one is that the big income differentiator today is the ability to work from home and how good your connectivity is. These are two huge factors in determining whether you can sustain an income. Quarantine, job loss, isolation, more time on your hands are provoking in a huge percentage of the population a reassessment of life, a reassessment of careers, of relationships, what is priority to them, and a reassessment of themselves, a lot of self-reflection going on. That's important because that's a point of inflection that every marketer wants to be a part of. How people navigate COVID is going to define them as consumers for the next couple of years. It's going to define their attitudes, it's going to define their priorities, and it's going to define their loyalties. And a whole generation of e-commerce laggers is suddenly online and suddenly reachable through online marketing and sales techniques. And what has changed in terms of product priorities, connectivity, health and economic security are the drivers. What does this mean for you as a marketer? Well, now is a pivotal moment to help consumers redefine their priorities and their brand loyalty. You must engage now with your customers. Segmentation, the traditional metrics we use for segmentation, which are basically demographics, need to be expanded to take into account some of the emotional metrics that we've discussed today. And you're going to have to reposition your brand, because Latin America is going to be living with COVID for the next 18 to 24 months. Yes, there will be vaccines coming on in Q1 2021, but I don't think it will be Latin American countries that get the same level of access to those vaccines as more wealthy countries where a lot of the vaccines are being created will. So your brand has to reposition itself in this new reality. We talk about the new normal, but the new normal is going to actually have a longer lifespan in Latin America than it will in wealthier markets. And you need to rebuild, reposition your brand for that. There are specific product niche opportunities that need to be addressed quickly before others do. And quite obviously, you have to prioritize your online marketing and sales efforts, but do so in a thoughtful manner, taking into consideration segmentation that addresses emotional state of mind metrics as well as basic demographics. So we hope that that is useful to you, and we have several questions. Abel, I don't know if you want to pick a couple of them and share them with us, and we can begin to answer those.
Sure, John. Absolutely. Let's get over to that and take a look at a few of these questions. A couple of them start off being a little bit technical, so I thought it was interesting to get some of that out of the way, because it speaks to the underpinnings of the study itself, and that might be helpful before we get into the deeper, broader questions that folks have. So one of them is from Sophia. What is the threshold between adapters and disruptors, I guess, in trying to establish and delineate the groups?
Hi, Abel. How's my sound? Is it back?
Oh, yeah. Back. Perfect.
I left too soon there. Thanks for taking over, John. But we got back on. It's a great question. The answer is very simple. It was a simple question asked regarding their behavior during the quarantine, whether they had increased, how much, somewhat, or a lot. They became adapters or disruptors. If they said during the quarantine they had been maintaining, in other words, making the same amount of online purchases as they did pre-quarantine, they were maintainers. Retreaters obviously were people who were making less of their purchases online. So it's not so much a threshold as a behavioral question.
All right. Well, also on the specific side, there we have a question from Gabriel that's focused on Colombia itself. He was curious to find out in Colombia, how is it that I guess the percentages between retreaters and newbies were the same, 21 and 21% respectively for each. So he was curious as to why that happened and why that result was produced.
That was simply the way the distribution fell. I'd have to go back and look at the crosstabs for that and see what the distribution for Colombia was across all 5 of those categories, but that's the way it fell out.
I'll take a stab at that from an economic point of view. First of all, of the 3 countries, Colombia is the least developed e-commerce market, the lowest percentage of penetration of e-commerce, both in terms of percentage of total retail, as well as a percentage of consumers. So that's why the newbies scored high, because there was a larger percentage of the population that was not engaged in e-commerce that, again, had to become engaged in e-commerce. And the retreater number is really a function of the ferocity of lockdown in Colombia versus Mexico and Brazil. In Mexico and Brazil, you have very different levels of quarantine by city and by region, with some, when the epicenters like Sao Paulo, Mexico City, having stricter quarantines, but in second-tier cities, much less so. In Colombia, it was more universal and it was stricter. And I think the economic disruption is stronger. Also, you have a high percentage of informal workers in Colombia, much higher than Brazil and slightly higher than Mexico. And this means that those people are very vulnerable to stoppage of income if they're working in the informal sector, because obviously they're not online.
I also would like to add that from the emotional perspective or point of view, in Colombia, we have more of the mad people or kind of a little bit negative more than Brazilians and Mexicans. And this is because the majority of the Colombians also reduce their household income dramatically, more than in Brazil and Mexico. And also because the larger percentage of people who lost their job either permanently or temporarily were in Colombia, more than in Brazil and Mexico.
All right. Another interesting question comes from Dan. So he observes that pre-COVID, we had many brands moving towards more experiential consumer benefits over the course of the last decade. So he's asking, is it fair to say that experiences may shift to within or around the home versus external travel, or even to enhanced accommodation and experiential facilitators within the home?
Great question. Great question. I think part of the answer is going to have to be a shift to trust. And I'm not sure how that's going to play out, but everybody is experiencing products and services in different ways, sometimes in completely new ways or novel ways right now. So that's a great question. I wish I had a great answer for it, but it's a good topic for another survey.
Yeah, from other work we've done in travel sector, this trend of experiential traveling, particularly amongst millennials and of course amongst the affluent, there's no question it was a big driver in Latin America, outbound travel particularly. But that's been eclipsed by the fear of traveling abroad, especially, and very real restrictions on travel that still exist in parts of Latin America. I think that also people are, when times are tough economically, people become more pragmatic. So in terms of the experience that you need to project is you need to provide a solution to a problem. That's the number one driver right now. If you look at the high preference for connectivity and the high priority that is on purchase intentions, that is to solve a very real problem that people have. And the other is helping people assuage their fears. So people are afraid for their health. As we all know, there's a big chasm of difference between the public and private health systems in Latin America. So gaining access to that private health system requires private health insurance. And so therefore the uptick in demand for private health insurance, again, is helping people assuage their fears. And the same goes for life insurance. But I think, again, experiential travel was really about opening people's minds. This is much more pragmatic, this reality. I don't know if Ricardo, you want to add to that?
No, you guys covered it very well. Thank you.
Mario has a question that's regarding logistics. So what he observes is that e-commerce requires logistics to allow for good delivery. So his question is whether the logistics industry in LatAm is ready to absorb this change, this increase in demand that we've seen now.
I'll take a shot at that. That's a great question. And in fact, in Brazil, you have the most mature e-commerce sector. So you have the most mature array of fulfillment companies to provide that service. And one of the questions we've seen in other surveys is the level of returns and satisfaction with returns. And the satisfaction level of returns is generally higher in Brazil because of its maturity level and a more consistent logistics industry to support. Where you have higher growth and new people coming online who are not experienced with receiving goods delivered to their house, i.e. Colombia and Mexico, this is a bigger challenge for the logistics industry. One of the things that we know is that the traditional large global logistics companies, they have very, very different levels of penetration in these markets. And they alone have not been able to address the fulfillment needs. And that has opened a gap for smaller upstarts, very interesting light asset models using sort of Uber-like payment and coordination techniques to bring private citizens with their own cars or with their own bicycles or motorcycles into a fleet of delivery people. And that is a booming sector, and we're seeing all kinds of interesting disruption there. Again, very different country to country, often local players only.
Then we have a very specific question from Monica, which I found to be interesting, which is, what about new KPIs that we need to measure under this new reality? So she's asking about whether, will there be new KPIs, key performance indicators?
For what, any particular
Industry.
vertical or industry or brand?
Yeah, that's not specified. You can always fire a way to specify that, Monica, if you would like, if you're still there.
That's tough to, go ahead, Rick.
I would say, as John mentioned, it's very important that for marketers that to have in mind that brands and products, when you launch a brand or a good idea or a new idea, it needs to solve a problem. So in the dashboard, in the KPI, at what degree this idea, this concept, this product is solving a problem? Today, consumers are not, tend to not buying or adopting a nice to have products and services. So if we have a way before we launch it, at what degree our product or solution is solving a problem, then it's going to be cross-tabbed and also check against the dashboard in the KPI. The other thing that we've been seeing when we analyze trends, the other element is the segment of one, with the segmentation and with the individualization of products and services to the customers, powered by artificial intelligence technologies. At what degree the brand is satisfying specific segments in an individual manner is going to be also a way to put it in the dashboard. And the last one is a traditional one that is more related to the experience, and because the net promoter scores and traditional ones that corporations used to do before are in the exit form. So companies are now need to have a new set of KPIs after COVID.
I could build on that just a little bit, Ricardo. Yeah, that I was thinking just about customer satisfaction and NPS and how I think they're going to be inadequate to the task of measuring trust of their consumers, of their customers. If you think about this, we'll use the experiential economy for an example. Have I been satisfied with the experiences I've had with Marriott properties over the years? Yes. What am I thinking about now? Do I trust them to actually truly be clean and sterile before I'm going to go into them again? So it's a shift in the experience needs to be good, but it's no longer just about a high customer satisfaction rate. I think it's going to be more about trust.
Okay, now we have another question from Uvitsa that is asking about what's the best messaging approach for brands that can't keep up with demand. I guess that's just very specific circumstances, but sort of what I guess it is involved in terms of messaging itself in that circumstance when you can't keep up with demand. I mean, other than saying you're sorry, I don't know what else you could do there. I don't know what you guys think.
Honesty is the best policy, right?
I mean, what else are you going to do? I mean, it is kind of a tricky circumstance. I don't know what else you would be able to say.
I think people understand. I think people are perhaps more willing to hear a true message that, hey, we're struggling too and we're doing the best we can, than they are willing to listen to, we're in this together, cue the soft piano music. And that message of empathy was nice at the beginning. I think it's old and worn out now. And I think people would find a really honest statement about your struggles with supply to be refreshing. And how you spin that, I'm not sure. I'm not a creative, I'm not an ad agency person, but I think honesty is your best policy.
Yes, absolutely. So and I'm going through the other questions. Another one that also is related to messaging that's kind of interesting here from Jorge. That one's in Spanish. It says, ¿Cómo debe ser el engagement con el consumidor más sensible de la situación de la crisis o con promesas de un futuro mejor? So he seems to be asking what the engagement should be like with the consumer. Should it be more sensitive with regard to the situation, or promises of a better future? But maybe both might be the answer there, but I don't know what you guys would think, because we obviously have these segments that are going to respond differently.
I think that it's both, as the British would say, both yes and no. The point is that, you know, the slide that Ricardo showed, where he built an emotional map of the consumer by those segments is key here. There are consumers who are going to respond well to a aspirational message. There's others who are going to respond well to a sympathetic message. And there's still others who want more of a, as John just pointed out, a pure, honest, you know, please forgive us. Let us help you in this time of need, or give us time to satisfy the demand that is out there. You really have to, there is no one singular message. And, you know, as Ricardo pointed out, the segmentation of one is an option. When you go to digital, it is so much easier to develop specific messages around specific segments, which is tied to the types of entertainment that they're watching, or it's tied to the purchase searches that they make. You don't necessarily have to spend as much on television and radio, on mass promotional mediums. You can spend more on, and you should spend more on digital, which allows you to tailor your message and tie that to specific segments. And I think that is one of the paradigm shifts for marketers that they're struggling with, but that now becomes much more paramount.
All righty. So Manuel has more of a behavioral question, and his question is, why do you think people want to go back rather than embrace the new scenario?
I think it's just human nature. I think we don't, as a species, like change too much. We adapt when we have to adapt. I think this study shows that pretty clearly. It took a pandemic like COVID to get some people to change their behavior in Latin America. If we're not forced to do it, if we're not provoked to do it, if there's not a real glaring advantage to doing something, we tend to stick to our habits. So it's just a way of thinking about the new normal. I saw another question about what do we think the new normal is going to be? Well, the new normal, as I mentioned before, is evolving right in front of our eyes every day. And the rate of change and the pace of change is ferocious. And so it's almost impossible to try to project what a new normal might look like. But I think that given human nature and our druthers, everybody would like 2020 to just start over. And I've seen memes all over the internet about that. Please push restart on 2020 and let's not go through this. It would be much easier if the virus went away and we could all jump on a plane or go to the beach or go back to the restaurants and the bars like we did before. But clearly that's not going to happen. So the question is, what behaviors among your consumers, among your customers start to take root, and not just in your category, but in adjacent categories and completely different categories that are going to impact the way in which they view your brand, your service, your product going forward in the future. And that's why I think, you know, market research needs to be almost constantly happening among your customer base during this crisis, because if you wait until 2021 or 2022, you're going to find out that people have changed significantly, and perhaps a big portion of them have moved on to other things. And so you want to stay on top of this change and figure out what's evolving in real time.
You know, there's a related question to what you just said now, John, because one of our attendees, Gustavo, is asking whether we think disruptors and newbies will become retreaters post-pandemic. But it's pretty hard question to answer without more research, because that could be a possibility or not. It's really hard to say because everything keeps shifting along. The circumstances shift and consumer attitudes are shifting as well, correct? I mean, isn't that the situation that we're facing?
That's the situation. And on top of that, you have to put the economy and their job security. And so disruptors can disrupt as long as they have the household income to do that. As long as they have the ability to work from home and continue to earn 90, 95, 100%, or even more of their salary previous to the pandemic. Newbies are, as John Price elaborated so well, are clearly the most vulnerable of those groups and have gone into e-commerce, been obliged to go into e-commerce probably to get the basic products just to survive as a household. But economically, they're super vulnerable. So what happens in the future is very much a question of how our economies recover, how quickly they recover, and how quickly we get back to some semblance of normality, I would say.
The other thing I think people need to study is, every decision that we make as the option to go back to the old way of things comes up. We make a decision based upon, okay, there's certain things that I do differently now that I was forced to do. Did that make my life easier or not? So if I'm a very busy single mom and I didn't buy online groceries and now I do, maybe that's a habit that stays because it turns out it saves me a lot of time. And the delivery costs are quite small, in my city. Then there's also the decision of, do I go back to it, even though I really would like to, but I'm still fearful? So a great example is, we'd all like to go sit in a restaurant again and eat again in a restaurant, or go to a bar and socialize with friends. But is that something I'm prepared to do based upon my fears today? And also fears of others. You organize a party and everybody cancels at the last minute because they're still not sure if they're up to going to a party. So you have to keep measuring the pulse of people, not only around their economic reality, but also about their fears and anxieties. Because these decisions, which sticks as the new normal and which goes back, is going to be based upon, did I solve a problem? And am I willing to overcome the fear of going back? And there's so much that goes on in every single decision that we make as consumers. And again, it's difficult to predict that. Our segmentation does take a shot at that. But again, you've got to keep drilling down on the emotional state of your customers to understand their behavior.
So related to this is a question from Vanessa that's about how to conduct market research in general and sort of what this study sort of means based on what your perceptions are. And she's actually directing it towards Ricardo, and she's saying is, how do you perceive marketing research has to evolve in order to survive in the post-pandemic world? And what should researchers do to deeply understand the new customer? New consumer, that is.
Yeah, I think the trends, what we've seen is that surveys are going to continue to be a predominant data collection method, but as well, data analytics complementing the traditional research is going to prevail. Every time and more time, there is going to be the adoption of artificial intelligence technology, like in machine learning, natural language process, to analyze open-ended questions, to analyze logs of focus groups or videos. This is something that is coming a reality. And that is the trend that we are, this is not adopting at AMI, so that we can understand and we can identify barriers and motivations of consumers at scale. Something that normally 2-3 years ago was very difficult or almost impossible to take or to get. I don't know, John, if you want to.
Yeah, I'd add to that, build on that, and marketing research in Latin America has lagged behind the trends in the global north, moving online. And I think that COVID once again is going to be the impetus for change in Latin America, and for a lot of qualitative research that has been done in traditional facilities to move online. And I think it has to happen, and it should be happening anyways, but I think COVID's going to accelerate that. And what Ricardo was saying is very important. It's the ability to quickly assess and get in and take temperature checks of your customers on a ongoing basis, not just a quarterly, once a year type of situation anymore. And it's finding out how they're adapting, what they're liking, what they're not liking, what's working, what's not working on a much more agile basis, I think is going to be critical to evolving your research program moving forward.
Yeah, big companies are combining surveys with the analysis of what their consumers are doing. So they have, based on their own databases, without asking the consumer what did they do, what did they eat, whatever, they just simply analyze. So there is a shift from making questions to just observing the patterns of behavior.
All righty. To shift gears a moment, then we have a question from Edgar. Edgar is asking about what about payment methods used by consumers during the past quarter due to confinement? So he's concerned about the accessibility for these consumers in the informal sector to be able to actually make the payments, because obviously with the whole retail issue. So I think, John, you might want to be able to address that one. John Price.
Sure. In fact, I'll be presenting on this in about a week. Payments companies and banks who are their partners have relied upon traditional credit cards to really be the motor of that industry the last 20 years, 30 years. And a lot of credit card spend in Latin America is related to travel, business travel in particular, but also leisure travel. And so with travel numbers down as far as they are, that has had a big impact. On the plus side, this expansion of the digitization of society. So these e-commerce laggers, people who avoided the digital world, are now forced to embrace it. And what is developed in Latin America in recent years are a whole number of tools that enable people, even without a bank account, to develop or to obtain some sort of tool to conduct digital commerce. It can be depositing cash at a convenience store and receiving a prepaid card. It can be depositing cash at a bank or even online through your online banking to receive a code which you use to make an e-commerce purchase. There are more and more tools available. Uber, as began accepting cash in many Latin American markets over a year ago. So the tools are there, and the impetus of COVID has really helped expand. We believe there may be as many as 30 million new e-commerce customers in Latin America this year. And a lot of those people have adopted a new payment method to enable them to pay digitally. We don't have the breakdown numbers, but we know that that's the case. So it's an expansion of the pyramid, the payment pyramid, more people digitally engaged. We also know that by virtue of the fact that they're buying online, when the product is delivered, they're more likely to use the sort of tap and go contactless payment methods. That is also a lot of the more sophisticated fulfillment companies are equipping their delivery people with the POS devices that allow them to use contactless payment. Contactless payment cards are quite ubiquitous in Latin America today. So again, distancing human contact around the payment environment, eschewing cash, preferring digital, these are all happening, even while the total credit card volumes are dropping because of the absence of travel.
Okay. I've noticed that there's been a couple of questions about very specific categories, like what what is the purchase intent for PC and video games and specific food types. Unfortunately, the scope of the study doesn't really involve in that. So if we tried to address that, we'd be speculating. We haven't really gotten into that. That's the kind of thing that can be resolved though with further study. And I think one of the things that we've shown here today is that you can put together a very rich study in a relatively short period of time during this period and get a lot of intelligence back that you can use to adjust on the fly in terms of your own marketing tactics. So that's just something to keep in mind in general. And we wouldn't want to speculate on those kind of results. So we unfortunately can't get into that. Now, to take a question that we can expand upon a little bit more, we have one from Tina that's talking about online purchasing. It's here to stay, obviously, in Latin America. So what she is asking is, what do you think that the LatAm consumer is going to need to adopt to this shift? Is it going to be better logistics? Is it going to be more security in online transactions, or some other factors? And that, I think that could be an interesting question for the panel to take.
All of the above, right, John?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I think, you know, security is an issue, but the two or the three biggest impediments to e-commerce in the past was last mile logistics, cross-border logistics, payment solutions, and the user experience. A lot of companies that moved into e-commerce hadn't really properly designed their e-commerce platform to optimize user experience. There's been a lot of progress in the user experience area in Latin America, and there's been a lot of progress in payments. There's also been tremendous progress in last mile logistics with some very interesting companies and models coming forward. The big roadblock is cross-border logistics. And if you're in a big market like Mexico or Brazil, or even in a mid-sized market like Colombia or Argentina, there's enough inventory in those markets of just about every product that's purchased that that cross-border is not the issue. It's a domestic fulfillment. But in smaller markets where cross-border e-commerce can be as much as 50–60% of total e-commerce, this is a real problem. And it comes down to two factors, and we've studied this for the IDB. Comes down to two factors. Number one is how modern and efficient is the customs process, which is really a function of government investing in those processes, in that equipment. And the other one is corruption. Customs remains an area of corruption in a lot of countries in Latin America. And the corruption that leads to people just avoiding the market, or to slowing down the movement of goods, or adding unforeseen costs. And that is a real issue for cross-border e-commerce.
All right, thank you. There's a question from Daniela that may or may not be within the scope, but I thought it was an interesting thing that she posed, so I'd like to just see if this is something that the panel can address or not. She basically is pointing out that the pandemic forced many people, the newbies, to turn to e-commerce by necessity. Obviously, they didn't buy online before, and now here they are doing it. Well, so what she is asking is whether we have any data on their particular experience and attitude as new e-commerce users. I'm not sure if we delve that far into that or not.
Hey, Daniela, how are you? No, unfortunately, we didn't get into how those experiences were going, given the time constraints of the questionnaire and making sure it was mobile friendly. But it's a great question. Love to find out.
Yeah, exactly. I think it highlights the need for further digging, right? To go a little bit further into this, and the need for a lot of companies to maybe adjust to try to keep up with changing consumer attitudes. As far as that's concerned. Let's see if we can take a look at some other questions here we might be able to handle, because a lot of them end up being extremely specific, folks, just so you know, things that are beyond the scope of the study. So I don't want to put our panelists in an uncomfortable position of having to speculate on something where they don't have the answers to it, right? Because I don't think that'll serve anybody very well. So I'm going through it now to see what we can do here to address a couple of the other ones that are more within the scope. One was from Jose Luis, is a little bit more concerned with the methodology. And he is asking is whether the questionnaire considered the role of the person answering it in the household, if the role of the person in the household affects the type of consumer that they are. And I'm not sure if that was in the scope or made a difference with this study or not.
We wanted the study to be as open as possible at the outset, so anybody above the age of 18 who was online, was actively online, was considered eligible for it. The only question we asked that had to do with role within the household was education. The education question was asked of the head of household, of the chief income earner in the household. But that's the only time we touched on role. Other than that, everybody's 18 plus.
Right. Yeah, and it's really difficult to get at that sort of thing. It's hard to get that much detail, especially for something like this when you're trying to just get a quick understanding, because you have to balance between gathering the data and making it convenient for the people for them to respond. No.
It's also, you know, this notion of roles in households is rapidly changing in Latin America. You know, when I lived in Mexico over 20 years ago, it was already changing in terms of the old contract was you lived at home until you were married, and then you moved out of the home with your partner whom you married. And as you got older, you moved in with one of your children, and there was a barter. You provided unlimited babysitting services, and they provided you with a roof over your head and 3 square meals a day. Both of those contracts are being broken, if you like. People are getting married later, which means that, you know, it's one thing to get married at 21 and move out of the house at 21. It's a lot less comfortable if you're getting married at 33 to stay at home with your parents until you're 33. So people are moving out of the home before they get married. And elderly who are affluent or even middle class are more guarded of their privacy and of their own lives. They're not as economically desperate when they retire that they have to move in with their children. And so you see a huge amount of empty nesters. It's one of the fastest growing segments. So you have a lot more people living on their own. You have a lot more people living without children. You have a lot more people living as elderly alone or as a pair. There's a much wider acceptance of non-traditional partnerships, gay, lesbian, and otherwise partnerships. So the whole tradition of defining a household and defining a family in Latin America has changed completely. And studies who approach the old techniques of defining a household will miss out on a lot of the nuances and changes that have occurred in the last generation or so.
Okay, thank you very much. John, there's another question here that you might find interesting that has to do with logistics as well. And what it was trying to get at is, are the local logistics providers changing to accommodate the increase in e-commerce? Obviously, that's beyond the scope of this study, but since as a company we also have logistics as part of our practice, maybe you may have some insights with regard to that particular issue.
Everybody is racing to capture some of the e-commerce gold. So you have traditional multifaceted logistics companies that operate globally, that operate in everything from air cargo to cross-border trucking to large long-haul trucking to last-mile fulfillment. But you also have local trucking companies that maybe worked in the automotive sector, moving product from the factory to dealers or to distributors who have very little work right now, and they have empty trucks, and so they're trying to reposition themselves as last mile. You have companies like Rappi, who basically began delivering food, and then other things to your door, are now providing last mile logistics for large scale e-commerce merchants. You have startups like Chasqui, who are use an Uber-like model and started in Peru and are now in Buenos Aires and are in Mexico. And they call upon independent drivers and use an app that brings them all together and transacts with the customer. So everybody's racing into e-commerce, either because they've got empty trucks because traditional trucking is down, or because they already have a connectivity with the customer through home delivery, and why not use their people to deliver packages as well to the traditional fully integrated logistics companies whose parts of their business are down, but they see potential in e-commerce. So yeah, it's a real race. There's going to be a lot of fallout. There's going to be e-commerce fulfillment is a tough business. It's a low margin business. You have to keep your costs down. So there's going to be, right now, there's a bit of a gold rush, but I suspect a year from now, there will be a settling and there will be clear winners and clear losers.
All right. Another of the questions focuses on the segments themselves, and Fernando was wondering if we expect the 5 segments to remain constant in the long term after COVID, or will there be fluctuations? Will newbies become disruptors? And I'm not sure if you guys feel comfortable about speculating on that kind of flux or not. It's tricky to say, right?
Ricardo, any thoughts on that?
Well, it's difficult to say, to see how the consumer segments are moving. Most companies think that they've seen experience that a segmentation study is worth to do it every 3 years or every 5 years. But now, after COVID, I think that rule maybe is not going to prevail because consumer behavior is changing very, very rapidly because of technology and other stances. So I think probably by the end of the year or early next year, we might need to validate these segments and to do another study similar like this.
Okay, and we have a methodology question that I think we can address here from Rebecca, which is how do we come to choose the 3 countries that we chose for the study?
Didn't we flip a coin? Isn't that the approach? Rebecca, we chose them for a number of different reasons. The size of the market, the relative maturity of the different markets. Obviously, Mexico and Brazil are the 2 largest consumer markets in Latin America. I think Colombia is representative of other countries in the sense that it's, I believe John Price told me it's a couple of years behind Mexico in terms of its e-commerce maturity level. Brazil's a few years ahead of Mexico. So we wanted to represent the region as best we could with 3 countries. It used to be most market research studies would include Brazil, Mexico, Argentina. Years ago, it was Brazil, Mexico, Venezuela. The economic conditions right now in Venezuela and Argentina, I think, were part of our decision as well to choose a 3rd country like Colombia.
All right.
The other issue, just lastly, is the stark difference of approach to lockdowns in Colombia versus Mexico and Brazil. And we knew that would impact the results, and clearly it did.
All right, excellent. Well, I think we're pretty much running out of time here because we've kind of gone over our allotted time by quite a bit now. I think that we were projecting maybe about an hour or so, and we've gone a half hour beyond that. There's still a lot of questions, but I think we're kind of out of time to be able to address them. Of course, you can pose those follow-up questions here, and so our presenters are up here, as you can see, with their contact information, so you can feel free to reach out via email to try to follow up a little bit more and find out about the study details, etc. And in addition, we're going to be sending out the materials within 24 hours. So by tomorrow, you should get an email from us that's going to have the video and the presentation slides, and that should be able to help you as well. We want to thank you very much for having joined us. We're going to wrap things up now. We hope that you have a great day, and thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you soon. Bye now.